Hi guys, welcome to Antique Sprinklers. So from the early days of the irrigation industry, perhaps as early as the 1920s, small rotors were used on turf areas on residential and commercial installations. And prior to the industry really only in recent decades all converging on gear-driven technology, there were many, many different drive mechanisms employed, and many of them were sealed away inside the sprinkler where you really couldn't get at them without coming with a screwdriver and taking the thing apart. And I'm talking about things like the Rhinomat ball drive, the Buckner cam rotors, Safety Lawn had a ball drive, as did Halloran and Yauk that they manufactured for many companies. The Buckner full circle cam rotors, Nelson manufactured a ring drive for decades. And it was kind of an open market in terms of the drive mechanisms that companies would use back then. And Rainbird, being a company founded with the invention of the impact sprinkler, was an impact company. And when the time came for them around 1940 to solve for the turf rotor with a pop-up sprinkler, they took their impact, they put it in a can, and allowed it to be retracted by gravity and popped up by water pressure. And the problem was solved. And so they have had a pop-up impact rotor for that market now for, 85, 86 years or so. And now the time that we're going to be covering in this video is really sort of the middle 1960s through the middle 1970s, and some of the challenges with their smaller rotors that Rainbird set out to solve. And so everybody who's a fan of impact rotors will recognize this guy, the 15111A, and it has more features than that original pop-up impact rotor out of Glendora. It has a spring that helps it to positively retract. It has a PJ tube to help with the backsplash of the sprinkler, and it has a lightweight, less expensive plastic case that also has a side inlet on it for ease of installation. There's a strainer in the bottom to keep debris out of the nozzle, and it's sort of that DA, that do-all variety that has a baffle on it for reducing the trajectory of the spray. So this is a significant improvement on the original pop-up impact from Rainbird, and it came along in the later 1960s. And there's a fellow that holds a patent on it that's going to play a role in the rotors that we're going to be talking about in a minute, and that's a man named Robert Bernard Costa, who went by Bob, and worked at Rainbird in the 1960s and 70s. And in addition to a patent on the 15111A, he also held many other patents and was generally an interesting figure. And so to talk about Mr. Costa's work as it is relevant to the sprinklers we're going to discuss, there was a vandalism problem with impact rotors. The drive mechanism is exposed to anybody who can get this lid either off or up, and you can mess with the adjustments so that it changes the arc that's covered. You can do damage to the drive mechanism pretty easily. You can bend a lever, you can break it. And so this was becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And so Rainbird wanted to come up with a compact drive mechanism that would not be so susceptible to vandalism. And they tried things with impacts like vandal resistant screws and everything. But honestly, if you can get a screwdriver underneath the lid, you can force it up and kind of do what you want to the guts. But in the 60s, they developed, and it was one of Mr. Costa's patents, an internal impact sprinkler. And the very first version, the one that he patented, had a multi-faced polygonal device around a spindle that had multiple impact faces on it, and so that this thing with multiple strike faces would hit the thing on the spindle with multiple impact faces, and that would cause the sprinkler to rotate. And they sold something like that as a hex drive because that striking face object had 6 sides on it. And they sold that for a number of years, from about 1963 to say 1974, but it was for larger turf. And so they wanted to shrink that down into something that would fit more that residential commercial market where you're looking for a rotor that's going to spray water, say around 30, 35 feet. We're going to be talking about patents that extended Mr. Costa's work, but before we move on, I want to note that in my research I discovered that sadly Mr. Costa passed away in January of 2026 at the age of 96. So that was a guy I'd run into in other rainbird research over the last several years, and I was always struck by some of the interesting products that he'd played a role in bringing to market. So I did want to make sure that we took a second and marked his passing. So the sprinklers we want to talk about in today's video are very interesting, very unique, and in my experience, very rare sprinklers. They are half-inch inlet, part circle and full circle internal impact drive rotors from Rainbird. They were only available perhaps for a few years in the 1970s. Hi guys, this is Bill. In order to correct something, rather than wear the same stuff and sit in the same spot and try to film it again, I'm just going to use a voiceover here. The patent for this full circle tripact sprinkler is actually the one that I showed you previously and attributed it to the hex drive. It is Robert Costa's patent. It works under the same principle as the hex drive sprinkler, and I'll pop that up on the screen here while we watch Bill flail his arms around. Sorry for any inconvenience. Back to the video. A couple of years after this was patented, around 1970, a fellow named Tony Radecki, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his last name exactly right. We had neighbors when I was a kid named Radkeys, and I suppose it's possible that that's how you pronounce it, but it's spelled Radecki. And he patented an impact mechanism that not only had an adjustable arc, so you could pick an arc to cover from about 15 degrees all the way up to 330 degrees. So you still needed the dedicated full circle sprinkler if you were going to mix these on a job site. But if you needed a half or a quarter or three-quarter, this filled out the product line. And it was, so it has a reversing mechanism in there. It gets to one end and reverses the other way around. It's interesting. It sounds on its reverse much more like an impact sprinkler than this guy does when it's operating. And what else is unique about it versus the original, and they're called the tripact sprinkler, is that it has a ball inside of it to help with the drive mechanism. I've seen folks, see one of these or a picture and refer to it as a ball drive. The full circle isn't a ball drive. The part circle most definitely, and you'll see when I show a parts explosion of these guys, the part circle definitely has a ball in it. Rainbird still calls it an internal, pardon me, an internal impact sprinkler. And it operates as such. The ball hits an anvil and moves it, and then the water swirls the other way. It moves it that direction. It hits an anvil and moves the sprinkler backwards. And it was meant from the start to be an all-plastic sprinkler. Has a very compact drive mechanism inside, and it was known as the 34P for part circle, and it also has a rubber cover on it, but as I said, the body is made out of plastic and all the guts are plastic inside of it. While I've seen the full circle version in a Rainbird catalog, I have never seen the part circle version in a catalog. Like I said, I'm missing 75 and 76, so maybe it's in those. I do have a technical bulletin that covers it though, and it has diagrams for and instructions for how you adjust it, for how you take the guts apart, that kind of thing. And a comment that I'll make is, this thing shipped from the factory set to 90 degrees, and that's how it's going to stay. The instructions really give you the sense that it could be a fragile sprinkler. If you press on the adjustment a little too hard, there's a spring inside there that can pop loose, and you got to take the whole thing apart and get the spring back in the right place or it won't trip. And they warn you about some other things when you're like gently trying to take the part that has the ball in it apart, and how you have to be very delicate so that you don't break it. And honestly, really, when you read the thing, it does come off as being fairly fragile. Anecdotally, I know some folks who knew people at Rainbird then, and they were hearing at the time that they were really working hard to perfect this thing. Ultimately, it was pulled off the market, if it ever really got a good start on the market at all. And then within a matter of a year or two, the mini paw came out, that smaller Rainbird impact that was kind of the center of their line for a long time, ahead of the maxi paw coming out in 86. And so while it does come off as a bit of a fragile sprinkler, this particular instance of it runs incredibly well. I am leaving it set to 90 degrees simply because I don't want to break the adjustment mechanism on it by torquing on it. And that makes for a kind of a slightly less satisfying video, I'd say, because it moves quickly and covers this tiny arc back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But it is for the preservation of the sprinkler that I don't adjust it out to say 90 degrees or something like that. It's an interesting way you have to adjust it. You have to adjust it wet, so it's got to be running. It takes 2 wrenches, and you'll see this in the diagrams that I post. And you have to have one above the other and turn it against a stop, and then open the other side. And it looks like quite a process. And I think if I ever pop the spring out that's in here, I would probably just unscrew this thing, toss it in the garbage, and screw another one on. It's kind of too bad that they didn't take off, though. It distributes water very well. It's an interesting design. It's nice and compact. It's not much bigger than a modern gear drive on top. So with the full circle and the part circle, you had everything you needed in the product line there. I feel very confident they sold a lot more of the full circles because, like I said, the part circle barely shows up. And this is maybe the third one of these guys that I've gotten my hands on over the years. And this one, I'm happy to say, came from my trip out to Boise, Idaho, to see the fine folks at Evergreen Sprinkler Supply. And actually, this 34F came from there as well. But when I saw the 34P on their shelf, I just couldn't believe it. And it's never been installed. It's definitely new old stock. And so I highly recommend talking to those guys out there for all of your irrigation needs in the Boise area. So with that, I want to remember the men who worked so hard to give an internal impact drive to Rainbird. They had a fairly successful small ag sprinkler that went on a riser. It was either the LP10 or the IP10 that used the same drive mechanism very well. So it's not like this was sort of the only shot for that mechanism that they had. And I'll also point out that if you look at some of their documentation around the R50, which is very much a ball drive, Rainbird also referred to that in some of its literature as an internal impact. So the concept was there, and it's a way that it differentiates them from the gear drives, which is really where the industry started converging, perhaps somewhat slowly, other than the Super 600 in the 1970s, and then significantly more rapidly once you got into the 1980s and you could produce those things at just such a lower cost than it took to make some of these more complex and certainly the brass sprinklers and that kind of thing. And they do a fine job. And I'm not enough of a hypocrite to not point out that I have gear drives in my yard here in Maryland. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way. And I'm going to let you guys enjoy watching these in action. And I sincerely appreciate that you folks continue to watch and like the videos and comment. It's really great to see the history of this industry getting out to so many people. Thank you.